I originally began to learn Sanskrit on my own in the Montreal temple through the kindness of some Indians who used to come and take lunch with us. 3 gentlemen used to come and pay a little money and take their prasad with us. And so every time they came, I'd ask them about the letters. How do you write this? How do you like that? And one of them brought a little grammar book for me, and I began to learn Devanagari. And then during the summer of 1967, well, let's go back a little. Prabhupada took sick in the summer of 67, spring and summer of 67, and just before he was to go back to India, he came first to New York, and naturally everyone came down to see him. And it so happened that Achyutananda and I went out to a bookstore called Orientalia, which was it's now closed, but at that time was, along with Wiser's, it was probably the best bookstore in New York on Oriental philosophy. So anyway, we were poking around, and we found a book there called the Brahma Samhita, Sri Brahma Samhita, and it had a picture of Bhaktisiddhanta in the front. It was published by Bhakti Vilas Tirtha and the Chaitanya Mutt. So I thought, well, this looks like the same teachings. So we purchased it and we brought it back. We went back to 26 Second Avenue. And Prabhupada this time was very weak, and he was sitting in his room most of the time, and people were trying to keep away from him. That was the policy, to let him rest. But we went in and paid our obeisances, and Jutanand and I gave him this book. It said, Prabhupada, we found this in the bookstore. Is this bona fide? Prabhupada picks it up and he opens. He says, my Guru Maharaj. Yes. And I said, Prabhupada, is it bona fide? He said, this book, he said, I had by heart this book. Brahma Samhita, and it was done especially by my Guru Maharaj. And I said, well, can we read it? And he said, oh yes, very good book to read. Now, in any case, that particular edition of Brahma Samhita had the Sanskrit in Devanagari characters, and then the translation, and then the purport in English, but it had no transliteration. And later during the summer, people were singing the Govindam prayers. And it was hard to hear the words sometimes in the song. And when that came out, the tapes of that came out, I thought, well, I have this, it was in my possession later in Montreal. And this was the Brahma Samhita in the society. And I had it in front of me. And so I thought, well, maybe I can, since I had learned the transliteration, maybe I transliterate this. So I began to transliterate this, and I did perhaps half the thing or something like that. And then I sent it to Prabhupada. And Prabhupada wrote me back a very extraordinary letter and said, well, this is wonderful. I've made copies of this for all our devotees to use. Please complete doing this, and you can do great service for the society if you can do more work like this. So that was the beginning. Well, I originally began, after I learned enough Sanskrit transliteration, Prabhupada gave me the manuscript of second canto of Srimad Bhagavatam to edit. It was the original, what he typed, actually, is the original typed version with some of his corrections on it. I mean, it was quite a valuable thing, but anyway, just say, here, take this manuscript and edit it. And at that time, a lot of people were editing Prabhupada's books. When I first came to Montreal, Kirtananda had a copy of the Gita manuscript, and he was working on, and I guess Hayagriva had something, and Rai Rama had something, and these were the early days of ISKCON. But anyway, he gave me the original second canto manuscript. I think that was 1967, 68. And so I began in that way doing some work for Prabhupada with editing, English editing and Sanskrit editing. And then, as time went on, I began to do that work. I began to do that work in 1968. I forget what I was doing. Yes, I was doing, and I was doing second canto, and then I was doing third. Prabhupada began translating again. Second canto he'd done in India and I think in some of the part of the United States, but he'd done it on his own. He typed it on himself. And he'd stopped translating for a while. And then in 1968 he began translating again, the third canto of the Bhagavatam. And he began doing it in tape form. Earlier the Bhagavatam he typed it out. Now for the first time he began doing it in tape. And he began sending the audio tapes, what do you call them, to Satsvarup. And at that time I was living with Satsvarup and Jadharani in the Boston Temple. There were three of us there basically, and when I first came also Damodar was there, and Devananda came and went. But anyway, Satsvarup began receiving the Srimad Bhagavatam. And along with that, to help, Prabhupada asked me to do the transliteration of the verses for the third canto. And he would send us, at that time, the pages from the Gita Press edition of the Srimad Bhagavatam. It had the English translation and the Sanskrit. And I would just transliterate these things and type them out. And that was to be used for the book when it was published. So I began doing that in 1968. Hayagriva went to work in Columbus, Ohio, at Ohio State University as an English professor. And Prabhupada wrote and said, start a center there and take Pradyumna with you. Pradyumna Das Brahmachari. All right, so I went with Hayagriva. And Hayagriva and I shared an apartment in Columbus. And we started something called the OSU Yoga Society, and became very successful. We had a lot of student participation. And gradually I acquired a house, rented a house in Columbus, and we turned it into a center, and invited Prabhupada to come, which he did in 1969 in May. And Hayagriva was quite friendly with Allen Ginsberg. In fact, Allen had come a couple of times through Columbus, and we met Allen. We went to chant with him. At that time, Allen Ginsberg used to lecture at universities all over the country and recite his poetry. And before the poetry recitation, he'd always chant Hare Krishna for like 20 minutes or something. He'd lead a big kirtan, and then he would recite poetry. So we went along with him to Ohio Wesleyan University, Hayagriva and I and a few other people from our group, and we joined in the kirtan and everything and went riding around with him. So Hayagriva wrote to Ginsberg, would you consider coming to Columbus and doing a joint program with Swami Bhaktivedanta? All right, Allen Ginsberg agreed. So in May we had a huge event at Ohio State University with the poet and the Swami. We had a big poster with Ginsberg on one side and Prabhupada on the other. And we rented a huge hall at the university, the biggest auditorium, put posters up all over, and we had a massive crowd. And Prabhupada came to Columbus. Ginsberg came too. He stayed in our house. Ginsberg and his boyfriend, Peter Orlovsky, came and stayed for like 2 or 3 days, and they had interesting. At that time I was working, so I couldn't be there during the day to take part in the talks, but of course they were talking a lot about India and about poetry and etc. and music. Anyway, we had the event was very successful. We had maybe 1,000 people were there, and when Prabhupada got up to dance, Prabhupada got up on stage and danced, and the entire audience got up and danced. It was the most wonderful sight I've ever seen. It was completely spontaneous, and it was wonderful. So as soon as I was married, Prabhupada had us, we came up to see Prabhupada, and immediately, someone's married, Prabhupada likes, well, now you're married, so now what's your service going to be? So immediately he gave us a very heavy service. He said, we're having our press, ISKCON Press in New York, and we need, for my books, we need to have a word processor, really. And so you can find out about IBM word processor. We can do Sanskrit diacritical marks. Please inquire about it, how much it will cost. And then you, since you were working, you pay for it. So I made the inquiries, and the salesman came, and I purchased this top-of-the-line IBM word processor and ordered it, and it was delivered. And he said, so she will type, we will send tapes, she will type, word process, and you will edit, she will type, and produce my books, sent to New York. New York will print. And so the first was Nectar Devotion. So we got the original, and kind of in our bedroom. We had this word processor, and I went out to work in the day, and she'd be typing away Nectar Devotion, and I'd be editing, and we'd send it to New York. We had this mail traffic between New York and Columbus. And then Ishopanishad was started, and we're doing Ishopanishad back and forth. And then it got too much because the press moved to Boston in 1969 in the fall. And Chandanacharya's in New York, and he's cutting up stuff and pasting us. And every time there was a correction, she'd have to type it out. We'd have to send it to New York for them to paste up. It got too much. They said, you have to come to where the press is. So I was president of the Columbus Temple at that time. I had to give that up. And then December 11th, 1969, we took a plane with a word processor on our laps to Boston. And we became part of the ISKCON Press in Boston.
When you say editing, tell me of that process.
Process of editing was I basically did the Sanskrit. I did some English editing at first, but then later I just did the Sanskrit editing. Sanskrit editing means I would put the correct diacritical marks on the Sanskrit words, and I would spell them correctly according to the international system. And for the word meanings, also I would adjust the grammar sometimes, and Prabhupada's grammar in the word for word, and also if something was missing, I would also send him a lot of queries. What about this? What about that? Is this missing? Is this okay? And I had a lot of letters from Prabhupada. Yeah, you can do this, you can do that. Yes, that's okay. A lot. And whenever prayers came up or whatever, I mean, I did everything like that. I did the calendar too. You know, Prabhupada said now you should do a calendar every year. So for I don't know how many years, 10 years or something like that, I did the calendar for ISKCON, the almanac. And Prabhupada would send me his almanac, and then I would have to do all the dates. And I would send it to LA and it would be printed up. You know, Prabhupada considered phones a nuisance, actually. He never had a phone in his room that I recollect. And maybe there was a phone around, so there was a phone at 26th Avenue somewhere, but when Prabhupada picked up the phone, he'd like pick up the receiver and he'd hold it like, he wouldn't hold it like we hold phones. He'd hold it like this, like it was a strange object, and he'd speak into it. He wasn't used to using a phone. And I don't think he liked phones. I think he considered them a nuisance. He commented a few times, you know, how can you leave, your phone is ringing all the time, people, it's a nuisance. In India, you know, if someone doesn't call before they come, they show up at your door, and you say, aye, come in. It's not. Prabhupada, one time we were sitting in his room in LA, he said, our Indian philosophy, he said, it is open door, open window, open mind. I said, this is our philosophy. We do not like to be blocked in. So that was philosophy. Prabhupada always considered that 4 books were necessary. The Bhagavad-gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, that's Nectar Devotion, and Chaitanya Charitamrita. Those were the necessary books. And outside of that, everything is really extra. However, one time we were in New York in Prabhupada's room, and I think Radha Vallabha asked Prabhupada, so after you finish the Bhagavatam, Prabhupada, what books would you like to translate? And Prabhupada said, oh, maybe it's Jiva Goswami, Shatsandarbha, or Vedanta Sutra, or he said there's so many, or Bhagavad-gita. And someone spoke up, Prabhupada, you already did the Bhagavad-gita. Prabhupada said, oh, he said, we did. He said, Bhagavad-gita. He said, there are so many commentaries, he said, we did part. We did a small. He said, there are many kinds. Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, everyone has given their Gita. He said, we said we could do many Gitas, not just one. So he had a conception like that. Shyam Sundar one time had an idea that we'll invite the creme de la creme to meet Prabhupada, and we'll have a series of discussions. So he invited certain people, and he arranged discussions. We went to see Toynbee at his apartment. Of course, Toynbee was very old at that time. And so we all went to see Toynbee. And he arranged for several lords to come to see Prabhupada. And I forget the name of the fellow, but he was one of the very prominent members of the House of Lords, a British gentleman. And so he came to Bhaktivedanta Manor. And it was basically myself and him and Prabhupada, I think, for most of the time. And sat down, Lord such and such. And Prabhupada's favorite, or he's seen most commonly, he would attack the English for eating meat, for meat eating. And he'd say, we're very... And at that time he had one kind of he decided he proposed that to start a separate society. And he would call it the Society of Sinless Men. And he said, we know with these English, he said they're very good in many respects, he said, but one thing, he said, they like to eat and meat and they like to drink. And so he said that is a problem. But he said if we can maybe convince them not to sin and start one society for sinless men, he said that is my idea. So this Lord came. And he was very high up in the House of Lords. He was one of the major people there. And he sat down, and he was also old, so Prabhupada greets him respectfully and greets him. And Prabhupada says, how old are you? And he says, and the Lord was slightly older than Prabhupada. And Prabhupada says, begins at once, he says, anyway, it was very funny because this Lord was also born in Calcutta. And Prabhupada says, so where are you from in England? He said, actually, I was born in Calcutta. And Prabhupada says, oh, well, what street? And he said, such and such a street. And it was not very far from where Prabhupada, he said, what street? And in fact, they were living in Calcutta at the same time when Prabhupada was young, the first few years. Maybe he was 1 year older than Prabhupada, something like that. And then so Prabhupada launched on the philosophy, on preaching, and he said, you have very many good qualities, but one thing that we question, he says, how you can follow the philosophy of Jesus Christ, do not kill, and you kill the poor animals and eat them. And the British Lord says, well, he says, that's a problem here. He says, and he said, that Prabhupada said, but you must be a hypocrite if you do that. And he said, well, actually, myself, I'm a vegetarian. And Prabhupada said, you're a vegetarian? Yes, I've been a vegetarian for many years. It was funny seeing Prabhupada with this English Lord, and it happened to be born in Calcutta at the same time. He was also a vegetarian. And then Prabhupada proposed to him that I have one proposition. I want to start a society called the Society for Sinless Men. Please help. One time Prabhupada called me, Gaur-Sundar and I were sitting in Prabhupada's room in Hawaii, and Prabhupada said, so you boys both know Bengali. He said, why don't you translate some of the important works of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, like Chaitanya Shikshamrita or Jaiva Dharma. So these books he considered important books, particularly these two books, Jaiva Dharma and Chaitanya Shikshamrita. And some other books he didn't consider so important. Harinam Chintamani is out there, and a lot of people. One time I used to carry it around with me because I liked reading about the offenses. I usually had to lecture about the offenses for the initiations, because I do the initiations. Every initiation probably say, now explain the 10 offenses. So I'd have to I'd recite the 10 offenses, and I like to, and also for observing them myself. So I had it. So one time Prabhupada was chanting in his room with doing bhajan recording, and I had a book with me, and I took it out with me, and Prabhupada said, what's that book? I said, Harinama Chintamani. He said, why are you still reading? He said, that's not a very important book. I said, "But it's about the offenses." He said, "You still about offenses? You still learning?" He said, "Finish." You're still learning about offenses. He didn't consider the very important books of Bhakti-Vinod. He considered to be Jaiva Dharma and Chaitanya Shikshamrita. And so he asked me and Gosunda to translate those at one time, and he considered that to be. And naturally, he'd read those very much in himself. Jaiva Dharma, I think, is the best book of all. If you took one Gaudiya Vedanta, one book from the Sampradaya, I think Jaiva Dharma would be the most important. Because Bhakti-Vinod in it, he takes all the primary points from Rupa Goswami and from Chaitanya Charitamrita and from the Bhagavatam, and he puts it all in one book, and he explains it very nicely. So it's an important book in that way. He kind of concisely presents everything in one book. Prabhupada had a copy of Mahabharata with him. He had a few books in his room. He had Srimad Bhagavatam, 2 editions, complete with 8 commentaries. Srimad Bhagavatam comes with originally, or there's one edition that was published way back in the last century with 8 commentaries. It's called the Ashtatika Bhagavatam. And Prabhupada liked that edition. And those tikas are considered authoritative. The Sridhar Swami, Vira Raghavacharya, Vijayadwaja, Shukadeva, Jiva Goswami, Vishwanath Chakravarti, etc. And Prabhupada read that commentary. That was the Bhagavatam that Prabhupada used for his translation work, and always referred to that very respectfully, the Ashtatika Bhagavatam. So Prabhupada had one edition of that and one other edition with 3 commentaries, and he had the Mahabharata and the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and the original Gita published from Gaudiya Math with Vishwanath Chakravarti commentary. Prabhupada liked the commentary of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti on the Gita, and there were several places in there that kind of changed his were important in his own devotional process. There's one verse about obeying the order of the spiritual master that Prabhupada said many times when he read that. Then he realized something about the spiritual master, and he used to refer to that. He said this portion of this comment was very important for him. But primarily for Bhagavad-gita, he used the commentary of Baladeva Bhushan, which is very complete. I forget how the topic came up, but Prabhupada said the Goswamis, he said, they never thought about being published. He said, that's the attitude. He says, you don't think about it. He said they never thought about wanting to be published. Kind of struck me, a shock to me, but I could see that the Goswamis, they would write a book, and if you look at all the Goswami books in the beginning, it's a line usually for my friend Sanatan Goswami. Rupa would write it. Sanatan would write for my friends, and afterwards they became copied. They were sent to Bengal to be copied, and that was the way books were published in those days. But in the beginning, they were just, they were written for the pleasure, actually, of a few friends. He says he said the Goswami thing. He said that's the Goswami ideal. And they're not, that I'm an author, that I've been published. They weren't thinking in that way at all. I remember when there was this group in LA that was interested in the gopis and things. And I'd just come from Udupi, where I'd been studying a lot the Bhagavad-gita. And so I was with Prabhupada, and I mentioned to Prabhupada that some people had said to me in LA that this Gita with Krishna and Arjuna, that's lower. And that they have no taste in that. We're interested in the gopi things. We're interested in Krishna and the gopi. After all, that's the highest, that's the thing we're after. The Gita is kind of like, and I thought that was a very disrespectful attitude. So I mentioned it to Prabhupada. And Prabhupada says, who says this? Bring them here. Who is it? What are the names? I said, I don't know. Someone said, and then, so I had to go inquire. He said, bring them here immediately. Whoever says this. So the members of a group that were discussing the qualities of the gopis and what were the saris they were wearing, things like that. So They were brought into Prabhupada's room. And then the temple president shows up, and everyone shows up, and this thing started. And Prabhupada said, "So were you interested in the gopi thing? So you, yes." And Prabhupada said, some discussion went on, and then Prabhupada someone said, "Well, isn't it true that in Goloka Vrindavan, the position of the gopi is the highest? The gopis are the higher. They're higher than like a cow, for instance, or a blade of grass. The gopis is the highest." And Prabhupada said, no difference. No difference. Probably between a gopi and the cow, and the blade. No difference for you. No difference. And it was like a lightning bolt. He was just absolutely adamant, absolutely fierce. For you, no difference. And philosophically, of course, from the very high platform, when you're actually have the perception of what is transcendental, you may make distinctions. When from the material platform, you can make no distinction about the transcendental realm. It has to be, you can make no distinction whatsoever. You do make a distinction, you make it on a material basis, not a spiritual. So for you, if you make a distinction, you're off the track, way off the track. It means you deviated, you're off the road. Make no distinction up to a point. And that point is when you actually have some revelation on your own. So Prabhupada was very, when questions came at that level from people who were not at the right level, he got very angry about it on a number of occasions. Prabhupada said one time, there's a story about Prabhupada and his Guru Maharaj. One time there was a lecture in Bombay, and Guru Maharaj was speaking. And Prabhupada said, we were in the audience, and I'm sitting next to an old gentleman. He said, just to show how strict Guru Maharaj was, we're sitting listening to Guru Maharaj. Guru Maharaj is speaking, and I am listening very attentively. And the old gentleman is sitting next to me, and very respectable gentleman. And he couldn't hear something. So he leans over to me to ask, what is he saying or something? And I leaned over and I said, and immediately Guru Maharaj says, "Oh," and chastised me for not paying attention, for speaking while he was speaking. See, so Guru Maharaj is so strict like that. He said, even I'm sitting there, an old man next to me, very respectful, and he wants to hear, but yet I should not do in front of my Guru. He said, Guru Maharaj is so strict like that. So he said, that is the proper etiquette. I was with Prabhupada many times when he had occasion to meet some of his godbrothers, and he treated them very respectfully. It's the etiquette that you're supposed to treat the godbrothers of the Guru, or your own godbrothers of the Guru, the same way as you treat the Guru. And you're supposed to treat your senior godbrothers in a particular way. That's Vaishnava etiquette, if you have senior godbrothers. So there's a story about that. Senior godbrother means initiated before you. And in Gaudiya Math, generally, there's an emphasis on senior god, but Prabhupada also observed this much. One time in Montreal, a scholar came to see Prabhupada, Indian scholar, and Janardhan was there, and myself. And I was always very eager to hear from Prabhupada, so I went up front. I mean, it was only Prabhupada sitting, and we were sitting there, but I kind of edged forward close because I wanted to catch every word. And I was a little ahead of Janardhan. And Janardhan was actually not only older in age to me, but he had been initiated before me. He was initiated in the first initiation, which took place, the first initiation Prabhupada did in New York. And Prabhupada immediately looked, he said, he said, he is your dada. He is your elder brother. He said, you should not sit in front of him. Not that I was in front of him, but I was ahead of him a little, closer to Prabhupada. He said, you should move back. He is senior to you, senior godbrother. This is the etiquette. He said, just like my godbrother, he said, Tirtha Maharaj, he used to be called Kunjada. Actually, his name was Kunja Bihari. Kunja Bihari Das was his name, but everyone calls him Kunjada. The Da means like the elder brother, like the uncle. So everyone called him Kunjada. Why? Because he was a very senior godbrother. He was one of most senior godbrothers. So similarly, he said we called him Kunjada. So he said, he is your Da, he is your elder brother, so you should give him respect. You should not sit before him. So that was the early 1960, 67, 60, 68 in Montreal.
Okay.
One time in London, when we were in London, Nanda Kumar was a kind of I don't want to call him a fanatic, but he's very concerned with health and eating the right things, and also with exercise. And he's very careful about his food. And so he was Prabhupada's servant cooking for Prabhupada. And so he was massaging Prabhupada, I think, in the morning, and he popped the question to Prabhupada. He said, Prabhupada, I feel I need to do some kind of a exercise in my body. Isn't it good for a devotee to exercise? What kind of should we do? Can we do yoga? Can we do some kind of physical exercise? It's very good for us, isn't it? And Prabhupada said, yes. He said, you can do, like, what it is called? He said, you can do, and he got out on the floor, and he did a full, very shaky push-up. He said, what this is called? And then of course it's called a push-up. He says, Prabhupada, you could do that. It's good for brahmachari. He read his books. Whenever he traveled on the plane, he would read Gita or Bhagavatam or Nectar Devotion. He'd say, see, I read my own books. He says, who reads their own books? He says, I'm reading my own books, but who reads their own books? He said, therefore, it was not written by me. It was written by Krishna. Every plane trip, he'd have a Bhagavatam. His secretary would have a Bhagavatam. He'd say, where's the book? And he'd open the book, and he'd be reading the book and thinking and reading and chanting and thinking. And many times he commented, I read my own books, you see. He says, but who reads their own books? You know anyone who reads their own books? People don't read their own books. He says, therefore it's not written by me, it's written by Krishna. One time in Hyderabad, I asked Prabhupada about astrology. So I was thinking at that time, I was interested in Indian astrology, and I was trying to understand how one's life is determined or not determined, and if you can read it in a chart, what you can read in a chart, what you can't read in a chart, what's spiritually there, what's not there. So I said, I asked Prabhupada, what about astrology? How does it fit in with Vaishnavism? Is it part of Vaishnavism? Do we use astrology? Because you can see that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's grandfather did his chart, Nilambar Chakravarti. Chart was accurate. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati also knew astrology. Bhakti Vinod also knew astrology very well. What's its validity? Should we use astrology? So Prabhupada said, he said, our Vaishnava attitude, the Vaishnava Siddhanta is, and I forget the verse now, it's Bhavatu something or other from Kulashekar Maharaj. And the Siddhanta is whatever may come, may come. We don't care. Whatever may come, may come. But, he said, if you know it's going to rain, it's better to have an umbrella. So he said it again, he repeated it. He said, so our philosophy is, as Kulashekar says, whatever may become by your mercy, let it come. That's our philosophy, that's our Siddhanta. But if you know it's going to rain, then it's better to take an umbrella. And one time Prabhupada was on a walk, and he said, so, what is the most beautiful animal? So devotees go, oh Prabhupada, cow. Cow. I said, no. Elephant? No. It says horse. It's horse is the most beautiful animal. Devotees go, a horse. So of course the horse is the most beautiful animal. Cow is not beautiful. Cow may be sacred, A cow is not beautiful. Horse is the most beautiful animal. I remember one time in 1968, Prabhupada had just finished a program at the Montreal Temple, and he was living in an apartment a couple blocks away. So he went out with his secretary, Gorsundar, and Vamandev accompanied him, carrying something, and I also went along. So we're walking along the sidewalk, and as soon as we were on the sidewalk, walking down Park Avenue, Vamandev says to Prabhupada, "Oh, so Prabhupada, that was such a great kirtan. I enjoyed it so much." Prabhupada immediately turned to him and said, "Kirtan is not for you to enjoy. It is for Krishna's pleasure. If you enjoy, then that is not kirtan." So it's a little different understanding that you chant for the pleasure of Krishna. You don't chant for your own pleasure. If you chant for your own pleasure, you're actually not doing the kirtan. You're doing what some call the Maya kirtan, not Krishna kirtan. Krishna kirtan is praising for his pleasure. One time I had to go out to invite some people to come see Prabhupada. Prabhupada decided to have a Mahotsava in Mayapur. And I went to invite some people to come. And then I came back and Prabhupada said, "So what are the results? Who can come?" And I said, "Oh, it was such and such." I gave him the report. And then I had gone to one place and I commented to Prabhupada, "It's so nice there. It's so nice, so clean, so neat and clean. It's such a nice place." He said, "Yes." He says, it is very, they keep it very nice, very neat and clean, but such dirty hearts." So different emphasis. When Prabhupada asked me about the Bhagavatam, called me, he was getting a massage, and called me up and asked me, he said, "So in my absence, you can complete the Srimad Bhagavatam." I said, "Yes, Prabhupada, I try to do that." "Yes." I said, "Okay, good." And I said, "And if I have questions, I could ask Sridhar Maharaj." He said, "Yes." He said, "He is the man. You can ask questions." "Yes, that's okay. That's good." And I mentioned someone else too, I think. And that was the only, I wasn't actually around, I mean, I was right there, but I wasn't around Prabhupada too much in the final weeks, actually, because for the final part of the Bhagavatam, Prabhupada asked me to do the translation. So I was actually translating the verses for the final volume, and that took all my time. Because what I would do is I'd do the transliteration, I'd read all the commentaries, I'd translate the verse and do the synonyms, and then I would bring it down to him and read it to him. And then we'd hold the microphone to his lips and he would dictate the purport for that last volume. So that kept me pretty much occupied, because I would have to have everything ready to read, and it would take a lot to make sure that it was right. So I had to go down and read it, and I'd go right back up to the room and work on the next verses, because if he could, anytime Prabhupada was ready to do more, I had to be ready. I mean, there was no saying, "Well, I'm not ready," and that was it. That's Bhagavatam that people wouldn't have. So for the last weeks, that's basically what I was doing. So I was right there. I was right in the next in the compound, but I was always translating, as fast as I could. Je anilo premadana koruna prachu